Hello and welcome to this Unit 4 video lecture. In this unit we will be covering the development of the city-state of Athens, and we'll be looking at some key moments in the evolution towards the creation in Athens of a democratic form of government. So we'll begin a little bit before the Archaic period, and we'll run all the way through the development of the democratic form of government that Athens is most known for. So we begin with the lay of the land, so that you understand the proximity of Sparta to Athens, and the fact that Sparta will dominate the peninsula known as the Peloponnesus, and Athens will dominate the peninsula known as the Attic Peninsula, or Attica. So these two poleis, Sparta and Athens, will be in terms of territory and population the largest of the Greek poleis, and at times they will be allies, and at times they will be rivals. So by the early to mid 7th century BCE, Athens controlled about 1,000 square miles of the Attic Peninsula. And the way the city-state system worked was you would have the ancient equivalent of an urban center surrounded by farmland, and of course, being a peninsula, Athens is going to be surrounded by water on three sides. And unlike the Spartans, the Athenians will grow comfortable in taking to the sea. This will be one of the defining characteristics of the Athenians, and as mentioned in a previous video lecture, those Greeks that will settle in that area which is now coastal Turkey, that area known as Ionia, many of them will have close relationships to Athens because of a shared linguistic and ethnic heritage. Indeed, in the mid-9th century BCE, the Attic Peninsula will be the point of departure for many colonists sailing to Ionia, and that will be a significant in later developments when we begin to look at the Athenians being drawn into conflict with the Persian Empire, and what those Greeks in Ionia have to do with the onset of hostilities. But let us begin in mainland Greece and the Attic Peninsula. Now, in order to control Attica, the Athenians had to undergo a process that many of the larger city-states underwent, and this is the process of Synoichism, or the bringing together, in which the main village of a region will lead a unification effort to bring all the Greeks in that region together as a single political unit. Now, scholars believe that sometime between the 9th century and 7th century BCE, this process of Synoichism, or unification, occurred in Attica, with Athens as the dominant village taking the lead. Now, the Athenians themselves attributed this process to their great hero Theseus, who was known mythologically as the killer of the Minotaur and was one of Athens' early kings. And we will see how Theseus pops up time and again as this figure to be revered by the Athenians, and how he is the guiding spirit of Athenian beliefs in how they should interact with their fellow Greeks and with the broader world around them. Politically, in the Archaic Age, it is believed that Athens was at one time governed by a king, but as time went by, the king lost power and was replaced by officials that were called Archons. Initially, it was one Archon, but as time went on, the number of Archons broadened out until in the late 7th century BCE, there were 9 Archons as a type of governing body, and each of these Archons would come from noble families being defined as some of the early founding members of the polis when the Synoichism occurred. These are the families that were most likely to retain their status through the generations, and these are the families that would supply the Archons that would govern Athens. Now, an interesting development occurred around 683 BCE with the introduction of a new policy which stipulated that Archons would be limited to only 1 year in office, with the idea being that this should be a revolving position and that the archonship should be rotated among the various competing noble families. So archons would serve in that capacity for a year, and then it's not like they go away quietly into private life. Instead, they retain a political role for the rest of their lives by becoming lifetime members of a council called the Areopagus. This council of the Areopagus is the hill of Ares, which was the location where this council met. It was a hill in Athens. And this council will advise the reigning archon until his term of office was expired. So with the creation of the Council of the Areopagus, we can detect a broadening out of political power, a trend that will become a feature of Athenian political life. Now, there is some debate as to how the archons were brought into power in the first place. The working theory now is that the archons were probably elected by a broader assembly called the ecclesia, consisting of all adult male citizens, even those of lower socioeconomic status. Now, some pivotal moments that are going to occur as the Athenian political system evolves include, the first one to mention in your Martin text, happens sometime around the year 632 BCE, when an Athenian aristocrat, one of the Aristoi, who also happened to have won an Olympic victory in the chariot races, his name was Chilon. And again, Chilon thought he should be running the show on his own because he was so exceptional in his own mind. And Chilon attempted to seize sole power and set up what becomes known as a tyranny in Athens. And of course, tyranny was the word used in the ancient Greek world to describe a citizen who seized power unconstitutionally and was ruling as a sole ruler. So kind of, again, a sketchy type of means by which you attain political power. Now, Chilon's attempt to become a tyrant will fail, but, allow me a moment in this lecture to talk about tyranny as a political topic that we will revisit time and time again because it was a phenomenon that occurred in many Greek city-states. Now, to get to a tyranny, we begin with an oligarchy in which you have several noble families, aristoi, a relatively small, closed-off group. And this, within this oligarchy, there is an intense competition as these families compete with one another for greater status, prestige, power, etc. Now, you're going to get exceptionally ambitious members of certain families who will decide that this competition is self-defeating and that the polis has problems that need to be dealt with. And this competition is hindering us from effectively governing our city-state. So one of these aristoi eventually is going to reach out to non-nobles for political support. And we see with the emergence of a hoplite class, this becomes a constituency that you, if you are an ambitious aristoi who wants to become a tyrant, you can make an alliance with this lower class, this hoplite class, by promising to take care of them if they provide you, the budding tyrant, with political and, if necessary, military support in establishing your tyranny. So the hoplite class becomes the key demographic to ally yourself with if you are an exceptionally ambitious member of the nobility, of the aristoi class. Okay, so now back to Chilon. His clumsy attempt to become a tyrant fails because his political support only extends to a few allies. and the broader populace rallies against him. Chilon and his brother managed to escape from Athens. They were banished for life from the city. But many of Chilon's supporters were killed, and there's this big scandal surrounding the means by which they were killed, because they had appealed for sanctuary at one of the temples, and they were told that they could leave peacefully. And then, when they left the temple, as soon as they were out of sacred ground, they were killed. But Chilon sets a precedent, and we will inevitably see another run at tyranny. Well, the other Aristoi recognize that Chilon's attempt to set up a tyranny it's a big red flag, and maybe some reforms should be implemented to prevent future tyrants from emerging. One of the key issues that was emerging at that time was the use and abuse of the laws by the Aristoi, who evidently were manipulating the law code in order to deny the middle stratum of society, the hoplites, the chance to fully participate in the political process by speaking at the assembly or by standing for office. This was causing real discontent among the middle class, who felt the Aristoi were not interested in helping the middling farmers have any type of voice, real voice, in political affairs. And now, if the laws were codified, so the reasoning goes, and everyone knew what they were, that would satisfy the hoplite class, the middle class at least, by providing them with a measure of at least legal equality. So that becomes the priority, is to satisfy the middle class before you get to the poorer farmers who are in danger of being sold into slavery. So there does become a growing impetus to get the laws written down and communicated to the public, either by public proclamation at an assembly or by having the laws inscribed on what were called axones, 3 or 4-sided wooden pillars that were mounted on a vertical axis so that readers could turn them and read to their illiterate friends. So that becomes the focus, is on the law code. Now, the guy chosen to codify the laws, to actually write them down, is a guy named Draco, and sometimes he is referred to as Dracon. And the thing you need to remember about Draco's law code is that it was a very harsh code. We actually get the term draconian, meaning harsh or severe, from this moment in history. In Draco's code, everything was punishable by death. And in a way, Draco succeeds in establishing this type of equality under the law, so that if anybody, no matter what social class you belong to, steps out of line, then they will be executed. But of course, living under such a law code gets old, and this is not going to address many of the grievances of the Athenian populace. So it was a start, and after all, Draco's law code did take away some of the arbitrary dispensation of justice that was seems to have been a monopoly of the Aristoi, and in doing so, for the first time, put some limit on the powers of the aristocracy, at least when it came to judicial matters. Now, despite this progressive step forward, the main socioeconomic problem is still afflicting Athenian society. Namely, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. So by the 600s BCE, this is a situation that could lead to tyranny, or even worse, a civil war. And that is because for about a quarter of a century, from 625 to 600 BCE, an agrarian crisis that had been seething for some time seems to have grown significantly more severe. We see the development in Athens of what was called stasis. And stasis is one of those phenomena that we are going to revisit time and time again because it never goes away, because it derives from the fundamental socioeconomic dividing line in any society, the line between the rich and the poor. And the Greeks had a term for this kind of class conflict. They called it stasis, which is translated roughly as standing apart. And again, it kind of connotes the idea of society being divided. And for the Athenians, the stasis grows potentially explosive. And as you can imagine, the wealthy aristoi controlled most of the fertile land. And Attica, quite frankly, is not a very fertile place for agriculture. The aristoi also had the land and the resources to begin growing olive trees and to create vineyards on their land to grow grapes. And these were what we call today cash crops. They were much sought-after products that would fetch a good price in the broader Mediterranean economy. Indeed, olive oil and wine were the two most prominent Athenian exports. So you have this situation where the wealthy aristoi have the richest farmland. They can grow corn or wheat or these other more lucrative products, whereas the poorer farmers are barely scratching out a living. The quality of the soil is poor, and they are relegated to trying to grow basic staples. And we have a situation where the wealthy aristoi are exporting their olives and their wine and are trading it for wheat that they can bring back home and sell on the market cheaper than the poorer farmers can grow at home. Now, what exacerbates this situation and makes it especially dangerous is that there was a system in Athens where if the poorer farmers needed a loan, they would go to the wealthy aristoi and get the resources, the seed or the means to plant for another season. But of course, farming is a very risky proposition, and if something happened and the harvest failed, and the Athenian farmer could not pay back the debt that they owed to the wealthy aristoi, there was that feature that allowed them to put themselves, their wives, and their children up as collateral. And if the harvest failed and they could not pay back the loan, they would basically have to give their children, their wives, and probably themselves into a type of debt slavery, a type of indentured servitude, where you work for free, you work off your debt at the estate of these wealthy aristoi. They were the hectomore, a status that was similar to sharecroppers. So you can see that this is a potentially explosive situation in which a growing segment of the population is becoming utterly desperate and ultimately will feel like they have nothing to lose in rising up. So the aristoi begin to realize that something must be done. And again, fortunately for the Athenians, the Archons at that time and the members of the Areopagus recognized it that we have a very dangerous situation and we needed to do something to defuse it or it will explode. So now enter the guy who is going to potentially save Athens from civil war. His name is Solon. He was an Athenian statesman, a lawmaker, and a poet, and he left us a written record of his political reforms in the poetry that he wrote. So in a very unusual move, which again indicates the seriousness of the situation, for the year 594 to 593 BCE, the Areopagus gave Solon full power to do whatever he thinks he needs to do to reform the Athenian government and society and head off the stasis that is growing in Athenian society. So Solon becomes a type of dictator, a type of tyrant, a legal tyrant, with the idea that he's got 1 year and then he has to step down from power. So Solon has this type of authority, and he goes to work right away. And the two things I'd like you to remember about his reforms is the first, which is called the Synoichism. And translated, this means the shaking off of burdens or the shaking off of debts. And this is a type of debt forgiveness policy. Those that had been sold into that type of debt slavery that I mentioned, they no longer had to perform labor, and their debts were canceled. And this is a way to alleviate the most dangerous part of the crisis. So the Synoichism, the shaking off of the debts, and you see in yellow, I've given you an actual verse from Solon in which he's describing what he did to balance out both sides, one against the other. And he gives to the people, I gave as many privileges as belonged to them, neither taking away their honor nor overextending it. And what this means is there may have been some calls for land reform by breaking up the larger estates of the nobles and giving some of that better land to the poor people so that they could become self-sufficient. But he did not do that. Solon did not do that. His reforms only go so far, so no land reform. And those who had power and were magnificent due to wealth, I saw to it that they had nothing shameful. So he's not going to strip away from them their land or their privileges, and he considers himself a powerful shield by not permitting either side to claim an unjust victory. So again, limited reforms to head off crisis. Now, the Synoichism is only one of Solon's reforms. The second, and more far-reaching of his reforms, is to create 4 classes of citizen based on wealth, not on birth. And this is key. As you know, the Aristoi were made up of families that from their earliest roots were considered noble, and they had a lock on political power. What Solon does is to say, no, no, no. We need to make this governing process more flexible, and we need to bring in more people in order to do that. We have to make a more flexible measure as to who should rule and what criteria political status should be based on. So he makes wealth, not birth, the measure of what socioeconomic category and therefore what political category you will belong to. So the 4 categories that Solon creates are going to be, first, the wealthiest, and they will be referred to as the Pentecosia Medemnoi, which is a class made up of citizens whose farmland could yield more than 500 bushels of produce in a growing season. And these are going to be the wealthy landowners who already are established as the top tier of society. So their status won't really change. The next category, however, are going to be the Hippeis, and these are the men whose land can yield between 300 to 500 bushels of produce, and generally speaking, the term Hippeis indicates that they had enough wealth to afford at least 1 horse. And of course, horses were a type of conspicuous consumption item. They're like a flashy car would be today. And this is before the type of harness that would later be invented, where horses could be used to plow fields. In those days, you had oxen to use in your fields. So horses are something that you use to get around. And again, it's like having a sports car. indicating how wealthy you are. Now, the third category are going to be the Zoigite, and they are the hoplite class. And as you can see, their wealth must be between 200 and 300 bushels per growing season, enough to afford a pair of oxen that they would use to plow the land. And the final class, the last class, the bottom class, the poorest of the poor, these were the Thetes. And they are basically laborers or subsistence farmers, and they have very little in the way of material possessions or material wealth. Now, the idea behind Solon's creation of political status based on wealth is predicated on the notion of upward mobility, that if you were savvy and smart and worked hard, perhaps your wealth could increase, and you could one day make your way up the socioeconomic chain, and therefore you might be able to more fully participate in the Athenian government. As we'll see here in a moment, the economics of this is married up to a political component. Okay? But on the other hand, if you are foolish and irresponsible, you could very well make your way down the chain, both socioeconomically and politically. So now there is kind of a flexible measure of what class you belong to. And Solon ties this into politics by basically saying that if you belong to the two wealthiest classes, you are allowed to serve on the Areopagus. And chances are you would be the Archons. Now, the third class, the Zoigite class, could serve on an elected council of 400. And this is a new innovation that Solon will help create. And we can imagine this today when we look at our own bicameral legislature in the United States, how we have the Senate and the House of Representatives. Well, we can see how the Areopagus, that council made up of former Archons, we can view that as a type of Senate, a type of upper chamber. And with the creation of this new Council of 400, the Athenians now have a type of House of Representatives. Now, the Thetes, the poorest of the citizen classes, could participate in an assembly which voted on issues brought to it by the Council of 400. So even for the Thetes, there is now a political role, although it is very limited. Thetes cannot hold any kind of office, but they can basically, raise their hand voting yes or no on certain issues that the Council of 400 will bring before it. So after enacting his reforms, Solon decides to leave Athens for 10 years. The idea being that no changes could be made to Solon's reforms unless he was consulted first. So he knows that the type of reforms he has instituted are going to take some time before they are really proven effective. So, according to the story, he takes off for 10 years to let the reforms work their way into the Athenian psyche and the Athenian political consciousness. Now, when Solon leaves Athens, things don't really get any better anytime soon. There is some relief for a while. Tensions do seem to moderate a bit, but the same old issues begin to creep up. The poor are still very poor, and the rich are still very rich. And that ultimately will lead to an enduring tyranny being established at Athens in 546 BCE. We will take a look at that development and some very important subsequent developments in the next video lecture when we continue to explore how Athens ultimately achieved a democratic form of government.